Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness, on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror, and check the show of pride, by open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit, and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace, fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease, and when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly bring all your hope to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread, go make them with your living, and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of hosts ye humour, slowly toward the light, why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom, to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent sullen peoples shall weigh your gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come now to search your manhood through all the thankless years, cold edge with dear-bought wisdom the judgment of your peers.
Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. My name is Andy Libson, and I'm joined by Kenny Zepeda and Alex. Eduardo's not here today. He hopes again, I keep saying this each week, he hopes to be back next week. But he's okay, folks. He's just busy. He's in Mexico, and he needs to find the space and time to be able to make it back on our show. So he'll be back. I want to remind people that we are online at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find the link to our blog in the episode notes. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode where you find this episode. Today, we're actually taking a sharp turn from talking about the U.S. elections, although we are going to be talking more about the diabolical system here, because we're going to talk about a little bit of history. Kenny, for a while, has wanted to talk about the new scramble for Africa that involves the United States, Russia, France, China. But we felt like in order to talk about the new scramble, we really need to talk about the old one. And so that required us to do a little learning. So bear with us today, because I think there's a lot of interesting things to be said about the system, about our rulers. Frankly, I found connections between the war in Ukraine and things that have gone on there. I think there's an immense number of connections. And so I'm hoping people will find this interesting. Alex, why don't you start with sort of just some of the basic timeline background about the Scramble for Africa. That starts what? How many years ago would you say?
Well, so I guess that's going to be where I really jump in, because as always, this is, the exact date that any particular period starts is kind of up for contention. The really important date that we want to look at is the Berlin Conference that happened from 1884 to 1885. So we can call that the zenith, the peak of this whole scramble for Africa. From then on, I mean, some territory still needed to be decided after that point, but it definitely marked the point when everyone came together. I mean, so many different powers came together. But I also do want to highlight the time before the actual Conference of Berlin, earlier in the 1800s, because a couple of the main players had already started to place their pieces, as it were, or they'd had pieces placed for a long time, right? So let's say starting at around 1820, 1830, right, after the Napoleonic Wars, the powers that are in Africa are Britain, France, Portugal, and to a very small extent, Spain. All right. These are all traditional colonial powers. Of them, the smallest at this point is probably France, but they're the ones that are about to kind of start this first initial prototypical wave of the scramble. France is recovering from the Napoleonic Wars. They had a lot of instability. Obviously, there was that long period starting from the French Revolution all the way. So the French Revolution, 1780s, all the way into 1815. So they have a restored kingdom, but there's a lot of stability issues. They need something to drum up patriotic support and maybe cause a little bit of economic stimulation, right? They already had trade ports in Northern Africa, the coast of what is today Algeria, as well as Tunisia, places like this. And they started doing invasions during the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, starting a more concerted push into these African possessions. And before they were willing to trade with the local rulers, have their fort, their little trading area, but they were actually starting to install their own rulers, their own colonial administrators at that time. Britain had always had a pretty sizable system of trade ports, but as soon as France started enlarging its interest in Africa, Britain and France have a long-standing rivalry. They start expanding. Portugal, which doesn't end up a super major player in this story, started with a huge head start. And so their two territories, Mozambique and Angola, even though they don't really expand from there, they do develop them very deeply, and they become attached to them up until the 1960s and 70s, right? So even though, again, they don't play a big part in this story, they're very much still a player in it. But going into this period of the actual Congress of Berlin, we have a couple of new players that come into play, right? So the big one is obviously the Germans, right? It's happening in Berlin. Between this time that I was first looking at, the 1820s and 30s, and the 1880s, Germany has become reunified. France is once again a republic. They're on their third one by now. And France and Britain have both continued to expand their colonial territories, and the newly united German Empire is looking to stake some of what's available for Africa, right? So they convene this large conference, the Berlin Conference, in order to have some sort of agreement between all these hungry wolves, right? They figure, because there was a general feeling of trying to maintain the peace, the long peace after the Napoleonic Wars, they were trying to have some diplomatic, understanding or solution to this problem that was obviously being presented. So they cut it up. There was a variety of nations that participated. The U.S. participated, even though it was not necessarily a European power, because they did have Liberia. Even though it wasn't an official colony, the U.S. had sponsored the creation of Liberia. And obviously the U.S. was starting to become more expansionistic at this time. So they wanted to get their peace. Even Denmark participated, they had small little trade ports here and there. The Ottoman Empire was still an important player in the area, even though it was obviously still diminishing in power. And they decided amongst themselves to draw pretty much arbitrary lines along Africa. Africa being, of course, the largest continent. Most cartography does not do the continent justice because of the manipulation that happens to make a map fit on a square surface. Usually Africa gets shrunk. Most people, until you look at a globe, you don't really know the scale of Africa. But they kind of just willy-nilly decided, they sort of use some geographical features, but absolutely paying no mind to any cultural or ethnic differences or anything like that. They decided to piece up Africa amongst themselves. Some additional powers joined after the fact, like Italy, things like that. But that's pretty much the general overview of the timeline of the Scramble for Africa. So it starts maybe around the 1820s, 1830s, and it's done pretty much in its entirety by 1910, once the prelude to the First World War starts.
Right. And I got a few things to say, but I have a question. Because some of the things that are talked about of trade would be trade or like the ivory and rubber and coca and diamonds. But in that early 1800s, that's also going to be humans. Like slave trade is also part of that, where uh, rulers in Africa there were within Africa. There's a slave trade going on, and basically you have foreign leaders come in and say, "Hey, we can take some of those people off your hands." I mean, and that's a lot of what that's so there's that slave trade that's going on in the early 1800s, and obviously the Civil War plays a major role in disrupting. That's 1860 as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, the only modification that I would make is the British Empire also started they were the first, because they positioned themselves as the liberal reformists, par excellence.
Right.
So they were the first major European colonial power to start outlawing slavery. But yeah, once the US outlawed slavery, the cat was out of the bag. Portugal still was involved in the slave trade kind of late because even though Brazil was no longer a colonial possession, the slave trade was still legal in Brazil for a while longer after it was legalized in the US. But by the time this scramble for Africa happens, 1870s, 1880s, most countries have started pushes for the end of slavery. And this conference actually formally has all of the signatory powers agree to stop endorsing legal slavery.
Right. Yeah. So what I want to add to that is some of the things that bring that make the scramble got that really made it like a so aggressive, right? I think I cited this earlier with you guys. In By 1870, only 10% of Africa is carved up, and by 1914, 90% of Africa is carved up. And the biggest things that I saw that were the pressure that produced this scramble from the European powers you mentioned are capitalism, are the fact that what you were having in the existing markets, and Africa was not part of course, there was trade and things like that, but it wasn't part of the formal market that of the global capitalist system that was coming into existence. That it had not spread everywhere yet. Certainly hadn't spread to Africa at this point. But you were having they had about a 20-year, 15-year depression that was occurring. The years, let me see, I note them. Oh yeah, for the years from 1870 to about 1890, there had been a long depression, and there had been a crisis of overproduction. Too many things produced for them to be sold, and therefore profits were falling. And so Africa was seen as a place of cheap products, new raw materials, new market, cheap labor. It was like a capitalist explosion that could happen in the context of of overall economic decline, and also protectionism was building between the various powers. And so they were kind of finding new areas of ways of getting around this because this is uncharted territory. Um, and my understanding of the Berlin Conference was very much the same way as you, which is carve it up. But they also understood that they hadn't yet fully carved it up. Like they actually set rules there about called the law of affirmative occupation, or darn it, let me see if I can get it. The law. Oh, the law. Yeah, the law of effective occupation. Basically saying, look, because here's how they did this, right? I remember hearing in high school or about Stanley and Livingston, moving through Africa, and oh, I met you. Good to meet you, Livingston. As if these people are just kind of wandering through Africa, but actually they were sent there to claim territories, make agreements with leaders, but also be the advance team for armies being present. And the law of effective occupation said you have to have an army present there of some force, because Germany, you can't say you own that, because if we see you're not really there, then France can come in and move on that territory. So that was part of it, and they did try to make it a more peaceful process, at least between each other, so they weren't going to break out into all-out war, and that did not work because World War One, they fight it out and it wasn't peaceful anyway, but peace between the European powers is what they wanted. But the other thing that was disgusting, and I'll probably leave this last point about the Berlin Conference, was the justification that they all agreed to. When they met there, they said, look, this is we're going to crack some skulls in there. They knew that they were going to be fucking this place up for wealth, but how are they going to sell it to their own population? And they went and people probably know, oh yeah, we're civilizing those savages and like that. But in many ways, it's worse than that, because they did talk about bringing Christianity, bringing commerce, and bringing civilization. But the big raison d'etre was ending slavery in Africa. So having taken all these people out of Africa to force them into labor in their own home countries, in the United States and in Europe, and having just recently said, okay, now we're not doing this. Now they go back into that very same country, slaughter it under the justification of ending slavery. That fucking boils my blood. And mind you, there is no end of slavery. Again, we're going to talk more when we talk about the stories of what was done with forced labor in Africa by the Europeans there. It's worse stories than sometimes I hear about slavery. So again, I was telling this to Alex, as I was saying to Brandy, once again, the lies aren't 120-degree lies. They're not 160-degree lies. They're 180-degree lies. The absolute opposite of what they're trying to do. They say they're going there to enter to end slavery. They are going there to colonize and to punish and to enrich themselves, and they will bring slavery there of a different sort. So that just irritated the fuck out of me. So I just wanted to share that.
I guess what I would add is that so this conference also comes in during the second industrial revolution, right? What some people consider that. So it's an intensification of technology, right? Increasing productive capacities, and so a voracious need for resources, and that's in part also, I mean, really one of the major reasons they have to go into these unknown places, because they knew the perimeter of Africa, but the internal parts were very inaccessible, right? Because you have mentioned before, Alex, that limitations of medicine and technology, really, and so by this stage, they are at a point where they can go into Africa and explore, and going there with things like machine guns, right, in order to just mow down the locals who had forces that used to fight in more antiquated ways at that time, I guess. And so that's one thing. What was the other thing that I wanted? Oh yes, and I just wanted to bring up that also in the mid 1800s, early to mid 1800s, there was a lot of independence movements in Latin America specifically, where bourgeois democracy is taking root. And I don't know if this is directly influences, because we're not talking about Spain, right? We're not talking about Portugal, but we are talking about France. And right, so there are some economic pressures, I believe, that come into play here for states like France. And so, yeah, I think that this is a good base for us to start a discussion. And I wanted to, going back to the technology part, that will be a major factor in what's going to culminate in this period that culminates in the First World War, right? Because we've also discussed in the past, in passing, the arguments that were happening in Germany, right? Or in people arguing that capitalism wasn't so bad after all, right? Like it was peaceful, and that things like these agreements, right? Gentlemen's agreements of how to divide up things, in a quote unquote civilized manner, proved to be wrong, and actually ended up in one of the most horrific conflicts, right, in the history of humanity, which is the First World War, and we'll get into that at some point.
Yeah, I definitely want to stress your point about technology, Kenny, because not only is Africa vital for World War I to happen, it plays still a major role in World War II, right? Obviously, it becomes an even more prominent battlefield in Northern Africa and Ethiopia during the actual war fighting, but it's also a source for a lot of uranium, right? So if we want to think on the source of, in terms of resource exploitation, not that that was an intention of the Berlin Conference, but it was an intention to have a resource monopoly. And of course, the US was there at Berlin And they were the ones who eventually were able to secure mining rights within Africa for uranium for their Manhattan Project, right? So this idea that you just brought up of the direct lead-in from the scramble for Africa into the First World War, it's so vital to understanding the entire story, right? Because yeah, it's Africa is sort of the last external push of the European powers. I mean, they're trying to do Asia, but obviously because of Japan and because it's kind of big in its own way, they know they can't totally colonize it in time. So they're like, well, there's Africa, right? And then after Africa, well, they can't really keep pushing out, right? And so they have this internal struggle. What's going on, Andrew?
And just to say that we haven't mentioned this, part of taking over Africa is that Africa was seen as a staging ground for traveling through the seas to get to places like India and Asia. So for Britain, going through the Suez Canal or going around the other way, they were playing on coal ports for both their merchant ships, but also for their navy. They plan on, if you're going to control the seas, you were going to have coal stations, and you're going to have port of calls along Africa to do that. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to really break down, and I mean, it would be good maybe at some point to have some sort of graphic of the breakdown of the way of which infrastructurally, resource-wise, geographically, on so many layers, Africa, became a part of this growing structure of the machine of war and profit, right? Because it's so. If you want to talk about disgusting, it's so disgusting to see how so many of these so-called God-fearing Christians, right? These people, Bible in hand, right? They had a Maxim gun in the other. Some people out there might know the famous motto of the Colombian drug lords, plata or plomo, right? And which means you either get silver, you either get money, or you get the bullet, right? Well, here it's sort of similar, but instead of getting money, it's either you receive the Bible or you get the bullet, right? And obviously, it's not like the European powers haven't done so before. The first period of colonial expansion that the Spanish and the Portuguese did was indicative of that. But this was the rest of Europe totally taking the dip into the psychotic, right? Because, countries like Germany had not necessarily experienced this level of exploitation of others. They had been colonists before, but that was within Europe, right? There were German minorities in Central Europe, German minorities in Russia, even. But it's not like it was a state project to keep controlling them. They were just immigrants, really. So we can also see this as kind of like some blood pact, of like all these people, deciding to tie together their destiny with this project of wicked exploitation, because there were a couple of powers that hadn't necessarily gone all the way on that scale, which is also, it makes it further ironic that, like, for example, the German Social Democrats are the ones that enable for the rise of the Nazis, right? Because in a way, their nation had been the one that had been touched the least of the major nations in time by the stain of colony. But they, by that time, they'd already supported it totally, because that was another thing that the SPD did. They continued to support the idea of German colonies. So, these things are all connected.
Yeah, and one other thing I want to add to a thing that was going to be part of taking Africa was the cheap labor, but also soldiers. Britain was going to use Africans as soldiers in their wars, and they did use them in World War One. I want to talk a little bit about some of the stories of, and this is before World War One, but some of the stories. Again, I just remember like just hearing about exploration, as if these people were just kind of on safaris and like just trying to like they had free time. But that was not what was going on. The story of Katanga, which is a province in the Congo, I think. And there was this dude who I think is Misiri, who was a leader, and he was a leader of a tribe that had real war skills. And so I think it was King Leopold. This is Belgium. The King Leopold from Belgium sent several expeditions to go in and say, "Hey, let's try to make a deal here. Like maybe we can." And he sent an expedition in, and one went in there, and no deal. Another one he sent in, and they couldn't find the place, and so that was. And then they sent another person in, and they described it as the next expedition went in, and it was like a very vaguely worded response, like he wasn't getting. And so the next Leopold sent in like his actual military, and apparently when that leader Missiri was not willing to strike a deal, they chopped off his head and put his head on a pike as a lesson to his people, like, don't fuck with us. And it's not just, I mean, people talk about, I've heard of King Leopold in Belgium, and like you read stories of like in part of Congo, I think they had 16 million people and they're down to 8 million people in about 20 years. So, I mean, that's literally a genocide. Like 6 million is a number we all know. Well, that's 8 million right there, and some may say it's from sickness and starvation, but a lot of these people are pushed off of the lands that they could actually live on, and they're pushed into desert-like areas. So they died. We know why they died. They were like, it wasn't that by accident. It was by the force of arms. And that was, Germany did a similar thing. France did a similar thing. I had less evidence I could find of Britain, but I personally don't believe that they were there. Like, I just believe the whole thing is washed in African blood. And the one story I heard of that really just disgusted me, because they were talking about these forced labor camps, and there were whole sets of laborers who had their hands chopped off because they weren't reaching certain
quotas.
They weren't stealing stuff. They just weren't getting a quota. Like, they weren't meeting a quota, so you'd lose a hand. And they actually showed pictures of the hand, not the hands, but the people. I mean, this is, I don't know what you call that. Like, that's, I didn't hear about that under slavery. It was bad under slavery, but this is the same thing. And again, these people are saying that their whole reason for being there is to end this sort of criminality, and they dive right in. And it's shocking, actually, to see. I mean, it's not. I shouldn't be shocked. I shouldn't have been shocked by the lockdowns and COVID and all that kind of stuff. But over and over again, I hear these things, and they are terrifying in some ways. The level to which these people are willing to do really bad things, and it's not just a recent thing of our ruling classes.
And I guess I wanted to highlight that part, that I guess making a leap, that here we have a group of rulers, right, in nation states that are coming to civilize and bring prosperity, right, to people of the world, the uncivilized, and that trope, it hasn't gone away, right? Because I'm just challenges this narrative of progress, right? Because at the time, there were people who believe in this thing, right? In this project, right, of civilizing, evangelizing people, and I think today, in a similar way, people get caught up in this civilizing, like, take the vaccine, let's educate people in a particular set of viewing the world, right? And so that is not exceptional to that time of evil people of that time, right? But in my view, these projects, capitalist projects, are covered, right, with these narratives that are sold to the rest of the population, when in fact the rulers who are going into these lands, they know what the fuck they're going in there for, and they're also sending their own citizens to go and kill, murder, and also put themselves in danger, right? Because they're also going, on the notion that they're doing something good for humanity, for human progress, right? And so, because again, just want to highlight that this is a gentleman's agreement, right? This is a time of peace, prosperity for everyone, where they're not going to fight each other, right? But they have an outlet. And I also think of the Communist Manifesto, right? Like where Marx talks about the need for capitalism to expand into foreign lines and bring technology and all this shit everywhere, into all corners of the world. And at this time, there is still lands that are unexplored, right? Which is something that I think is going to factor into when we talk about the second part of the Scramble for Africa and what's going on today. But at this time, there's still places to be had without confronting each other directly.
And one last thing that I forgot to mention, the Suez Canal gets built in this time by largely African labor, and it's estimated up to 100,000 Africans are killed in the making of the Suez Canal. And we know how important that is, not just then, but to today. And again, African blood had to be spilled in order for US, European, Middle Eastern shipping lanes to be accessed.
Yeah, I mean, over and over again, reading these horrific stories, and I have over the years, you know, I mean, it's not something I do often just because of how uncomfortable it is, but it is also something I try to remind myself of frequently enough that it stays somewhere in my mind because we should not forget about this, you know. One of the main sins that I would say that these, you know, Europeans committed was dehumanizing, right, the African populace. They didn't see them as human, right? The so-called best of them, right? Again, these like liberal reformers in like the UK or places like that, they essentially believed that Africans could earn their way to being human, right? So that justifies anything, right? When the person across from you is not even a person to you, right? Is less than even a dog, right? Because men, you know, most of these Europeans would probably treat their pack animals better than they would the so-called servants and coolies that they used, right? Code words for slaves, you know. And yeah, I mean, I keep coming back to the comment you made, Andrew, about the 180, you know, because to reinforce this whole message about the Christian mission, you know, I think back to the white man's burden, you know, Rudyard Kipling. I mean, let me briefly make that kind of little aside. Things like Tarzan, right? Things like all this, you know, stuff. It romanticizes this, you know, explorer image that you talk about. But someone like Rudyard Kipling was, you know, if you look at his poem, you know, The White Man's Burden, he's literally just justifying. And if you connect it to stories like the 100,000 dead in the Suez Canal, when you connect it to stories like the tortured people in the Belgian Congo, right? Belgium, when people think of Belgium, they think of waffles, they think of chocolate, you know, they think, oh, Belgium, how nice. Oh, what a beautiful country, the Low Country. You know, nobody thinks anything bad of Belgium. You know, no average person is like, oh, Belgium is evil. But what did you know? Sure, maybe the whole nation didn't do it. You know, it was okay. It was King Leopold, but he was the king of the Belgians. What are you supposed to? You know, that has to be some sort of historical stain, and yet they've escaped it. You know, even the French, some of the main still players, they've managed to outlive a lot of the other powers to this day. Most Americans, they have a sort of romanticized, oh, the French, oh, you know, those white flag, oh, they wouldn't hurt a fly. They're just a bunch of, you know, they wear their berets, you know, and oh, I'm good, yes, you know, everything. But what does it mean? You know, these French people have actually taken part in the continued extraction of wealth by any means necessary because these people are not human to them. And I think that's something that I also want to emphasize is you only get to this point by dehumanizing people. You know, so even people that you might consider your opposites, your enemies, I think that's one of the powerful things here.
Can I throw one point in there real quick? So we've talked about religion and these liberal values, right? And also science, right? Like and how like we've had discussions here of, you know, what is science in you know, in the context of COVID, right? And then we started digging back and looked at capitalist science but again, in this period, right, literally using science to justify the superiority of, you know, the people that are going to go and do these things, right? And how not objective science is really, and it's proven that in many periods of history, but particularly in this justification of conquering subhumans.
Yeah, and just like there was during the period of manifest destiny in the United States and the displacement and this, you know, killing of indigenous in North America, there was like people like General Custer, and there were people who were idolized actually as war heroes, as people who were like examples of what it was to be an American and an American hero because of their ability to kill. And you had the very same figures in France. I saw posters like French posters, Belgian posters of heroes, and this is stuff sold. Again, here's the cognitive dissonance. You have to sell to your population that you're ending slavery, and yet your heroes going there are slaughtering the people, and you show it right to their face. We see this today, like all me, Alex, and Kenny, and I know Eduardo and my friends. we were like, how can people think this and do this? You know, like how can they keep that dissonance up? But they clearly can. And one other thing, what was his name? Carl Hagenbeck. I think the person who started zoos, bringing back African creatures, animals, and putting them in places and pens for people to see. He and others brought back humans. They would put them in their natural terrain, like in the way that you say, okay, we're not going to put them sometimes they put them in cages actually, but if they didn't put them in cages, they put them like wolves would have a free area. You don't really see a cage, you just see a penned area and this is how they would put the people from these areas in their dress and in the way they were, and sometimes they were in cages, naked or half naked. And the thing that bothered me the most about that was not just how disgusting that was, but how popular that was. They were talking about hundreds of thousands of people would swarm into these zoos to see humans. And it's debasing, you know. And you know, I believe in revolution, but man, sometimes humans, we got it all fucked up.
Yeah, I another point that I quickly wanted to make was just to roll back a little bit, but also off of what you just said. In a lot of ways, you can conclusively say that the Europeans brought the savageness to Africa, right? I think that's really what we're saying here. You know, as much as I don't want to paint this picture. Same thing with like the Americas. You know, Africa was not an idyllic paradise. I don't want to create that image. I will say a lot of the reason why there was savagery in Africa was because of Islam, right? So there is that, right? Because the slave trade in Africa was mostly funded by first Arabs and then just other Muslim lords that had come up. But regardless, as much as there was already a substrate of fucked up shit in Africa, what the Europeans brought was an entirely new scale that Africa probably would have never developed organically, right? And again, to think back to all of to today, people that still hold some of these colonial racial ideas, to think like these are the people. Like this is exactly this 180 thing that you're talking about. I've said before, this jujitsu thing, this inversion of, oh, you're a savage, right? That old saying, whenever you point a finger, there's so many fingers pointing back at you. In this case, it's so true. These European powers show up to countries that they have no real connection to, no actual need to colonize. It's not like their countries are about to fall into disrepair and they're running out of resources. It's not like the great migrations of the past. No, it's because they have a whim. They've decided, they have an economic system where it's been built up and they've decided it's a need, but it isn't really, it's not going to kill anyone in Europe if the scramble for Africa doesn't happen. But they find it necessary, and it is so obscene. I mean, it's hard to talk about these things because obviously, you end up talking about the European white man, and you end up kind of falling into this conversation about, are white people inherently evil? As like a brown man, these conversations happen pretty often, especially in the context of the US. And I don't mean to have that conversation necessarily, but I do want to have a naked conversation about the fact that the way that European powers moved from almost from the very beginning, starting from Rome. Let's at least start from Rome. From Rome up until the modern day, they have always pushed the envelope on cruelty. I think so. And on not only pushing the envelope on cruelty, but pushing the envelope on dressing up your shit and saying it's gold, right? I think, and it's unrefutable that they have been the leaders of that, right? If the European powers have been best at anything, it has been at being conniving evildoers.
And one thing I would say that, because I would say that they needed to go into Africa in the same way that the U.S. needs to fight this war in Ukraine, and needs to now extend the war into Iran, and needs to extend the war to Taiwan, even though everyone's like, what the hell are they doing? They're going to lose. But they need to, because if they don't, they will lose. And losing is not, and I don't mean losing like, oh, that sucks, but losing means you are off the table. Because if we could seal Africa off and like literally say they can't get there in 1880 or 1870, then I believe World War I happens by 1890. You know, then the European powers are going to be at each other, with Asia being involved, the United States, and millions will be killed by 20 years earlier. And that's what this did, was stave it off. But again, staved it off with a giant body count. And I think this is what people have to understand about the logic of capitalism. You can run, but you cannot hide. There is no answer other than revolution. Like, the only thing that could have stopped that was revolution. Profits will not stop. Making profits are not going to stop capitalism. Eventually, crisis hits, and the profits drain up. Overproduction happens. The fall in the rate of profit, and the tariffs start mounting up. And eventually, it gets to the point where there's no new place to go, and those tariffs have to come down. And I'm going to fucking force them down with my military, one way or another. And then the body count goes up again. And so I would say they had to do it. I mean, you're right in saying these people are still disgustingly wealthy, and they would have been disgustingly wealthy throughout most of the crisis, but they're not willing to lose. And that's just the nature of the system, apparently, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where to go from here. I guess I just comment on you, Alex. What you know, like, I want to challenge this notion of, yes, Europe happened to be the place that, you know, invented capitalism, you know, or like and then by also certain luck, right? Like, they also had the right, like, ingredients to make it happen, to develop and accelerate technology, right? And because technology is central to capitalism, you know, and expanding. And again, you brought up, Lipson touched on it, that Africa, slavery wasn't just a European venture. There were African warlords that were capturing, you know, other peoples in selling them into the system, right? Like, and so I guess and there was empires in the Americas, right? There was the Ottoman empires. There's empires everywhere, right? But this particular group, right, European, at this particular time, had the right ingredients to develop this voracious, unleash really this voracious system. This is something else that the Communist Manifesto mentions, right? Like the how I don't know if you can help me, Lipson, but Marx talks about like a wizard who unleashes a power that you cannot put back in the bottle.
Yeah,
and that's what capitalism is. You know, it's been unleashed, right? It started eating away foreign peoples under the pretext of civilizing them, and then it ends in World War I, right? Like, again, Europeans commit this incredible acts of violence that decimate their population, right? Millions and millions of people die in the First and Second World War. And again, and all that is to say that this system will affect everyone, you know, and it ends in what just Lipson just described, right? And here we are again in a period where there is no more room to move, right? There is no Africa to unload, you know, there is no other populations to exploit. Everything's been partitioned, and by and large, the U.S. has enjoyed, you know, a lot of freedom in exercising pressure. It looks different, you know, it's slightly different, but nonetheless, it is an imperial venture, right? But those mechanisms that are the liberal democracy, right? Just like in this period, they're coming undone at this time and place. So it does, this process does remind me, right, of what's going on in front of us, right? This facade is falling off. That we know we're here to liberate the world, bring progress in technology that is freeing technology. But in reality, it leads to imprisonment, it leads to death, and it leads to a massive clash of the powers that are not in here to share, because this capitalist system, right? And we're talking about the people who actually rule the world, because I think there's a lot of people who, you know, the petit bourgeois, right? Like the business people, like I'm an entrepreneur, right? That's the latest thing. And you believe you're a capitalist, you actually have a say in the system, but you don't. The people who actually do are going to drive you to war and expose you to whatever the fuck they have to, because you're a piece in the puzzle. So yes, you're an aspirational capitalist, but it doesn't mean that you actually have your safety and your well-being long term is actually attached to this system. And so that's what I want to throw in there, because like in those periods too, the people that were forced out, because the people who colonized, by and large, they weren't all wealthy people. The masses of people from these empires were not. My partner's family, they ended up in Africa from Portugal, because they had to. There was no other way. So that's why I want to challenge this idea that they were all evil people, right? But put in a certain situation, people will do evil things because you have to fucking survive. But the people who set the fucking game up, who set the rules and move the pieces, those are the true evils. And to think that we all have control of this system, it's a fucking farce. And the last point I'll make is because I listened to this dude, I forget his name, but he's very famous in making videos on social media about history. And he talks about this horrible time, but now we live in a period of freedom. Yes, that happened, but now we live in a period of progress. And I'm like, what the fuck? Where are you reading your history? Like, and you're talking about that dissonance, because we get thrown numbers around, right? About how many people live above poverty, how much longer we live. And that is just obscures the fact of what the fuck is happening in the world and where we're heading.
Yeah, I mean, I guess something else that I do want to point out is, I guess all the time I'm just wondering what the particular message is that every group of people is going to have to hear. I think we all have to hear a slightly different message. Is I guess the thing why I'm kind of addressing American, European, white people in that way, because I also do agree with the other part of your message. Like, as a Mexican man, like, I don't embrace the Aztecs. I don't. They were a bunch of imperialist, like, brutalizers of their own people and of people that were similarly related to them. I don't want to embrace that idealism. It is a point that for the past several hundred years, the Europeans have been the standard bearers of autocratic power. I would say, I would think capitalism is really feudalism, but drunk, temporarily. It kind of seems like the capitalists are sobering up and they're remembering that they're feudalists, because that, to me, really is the system that they would have wanted to begin with. But there is this other current which has always existed, which is the people that are being exploited, right? Whether it's the people that are totally disconnected from the exploiters, or the people that are the unwitting servants of the exploiters, and there's lots of layers to that here, of course. But I guess just to bring it a little bit into this preview of what's happening today, and to think about what was happening then historically, the question then is the question today. Are you going to allow for global war? Are you going to endorse global exploitation? Right? Taking sides is still endorsing it, right? I think that's the point about this whole multipolar idealism that we want to defeat totally. If you're taking any country's side in this ongoing struggle, you've already lost as a person. The very idealism, which, even if it's not a Western country, right? Some people want to uphold China, right? No, okay. The central, the Middle Kingdom, which China descends from, was another source of machinations of power, of so many new ways of being cruel, right? For many years, right? So overall, it's right. Internationally, although it may have a slightly different face from country to country, culture to culture, the problem is still autocrats and the idealism that they promote as a unifying ideal that is actually the tool of oppression, the tool of division, the tool of unnecessary global struggle. Because that's what we're faced with once again. The Third World War is very much like the First World War. We all know what's happening, and most people, I would say, of the vast majority of people, in their heart of hearts, they don't really think it should be happening, but they're still going to follow as long as they believe that there's no alternative.
Yeah, I think that really gets us to next week's episode, which I think is that we are saying that there's another Scramble for Africa happening. I want to look more into it because I'm suspecting if you look under the hood, there's going to be a lot more nasty things than even I already know about, or even think that I know about. So I guess we'll talk about that next week. One point I guess I wanted to make was it is interesting to me that the first industrial revolution, which brought the steam engine, led to the displacement of so many people, the deaths of so many people through British enclosure laws and things like that. And it's interesting that the second industrial revolution, which then had railroads and communication and medicine starting, is it an accident that also comes with another cut and blood being spilled again? Because I think we talk about the current period right now as a fourth industrial revolution, and I think with it another displacement and another body count and another very dangerous world. So I don't know if those are accidents, that these technological breakthroughs are so violent at the same time and so deadly. I'll just pose that. I mean, if anybody wants to say anything about that, because I haven't really thought about it.
I mean, I guess I don't want to get ahead to the next episode, but I mean, what we see in this period, right, is a complete technological domination, right, of these European imperialists. Again, we mentioned the machine gun. They're just mowing down people who don't have a machine gun. But I think that will be slightly different in this period currently, and we'll get into that later. But again, just to emphasize this mismatch, right? Like there were warriors, there were in Africa, but they just couldn't, just like the natives in the Americas couldn't meet the technological superiority of these invaders, right? Otherwise, we'd be maybe telling another story,
Probably speaking in a different language. That's there's so much to consider there. I mean, part of my reason for being a radical, for being a revolutionary, has been this fundamental belief that so much of humanity's progress has taken the worst way out, or really it could have been done some other way, but because we've been invested reinvested in this action of cruelty, people have continued to find ways to justify extraction and manipulation, right? Verticalization rather than being horizontal. That's because I don't believe, some primitivists might believe, that technology itself is the curse. I mean, that is a conversation to have, right? I think it's worth having because of the depths that we've gone to, at least in our analysis of Africa, and honestly of every conflict that we're talking about. But I do think there is definitely, like, the technology we know today, almost all of it is marked by this evil. Like that's for sure. And it does definitely support, like Kenny and Andrew, like your criticism of the modern scientific discipline, right? Because although it may say things which have some deep truth, and there have been some things which obviously, they're bearing fruit. It's not that it's false necessarily, but there is such a fundamental flaw at the base, and this flaw has actually been reinforced itself, that there does have to be such a fundamental re-evaluation and re-examining of what we even believe, the way we do things. Like, and yeah, I mean, that just reminds me and brings me back to my motivation for being a radical, being a revolutionary, is feeling like, while people that call themselves rational might want to call for moderation, it really seems like the most rational thing, if you really want humanity to stop competing and to start collaborating, we have to totally and radically commit to a absolute change of human society.
I mean, I guess, yeah, I mean, we'll have to have a conversation about that. But for better or for worse, we are in a world, and I'm hinting at the noosphere here, where there is more awareness of each other, right? Um, I and we, because whatever happens has to happen globally, right? This thing has spread everywhere, and it cannot just happen in one place. We've talked about If it starts, it has to spread. The Chinese have to fight their own ruling class, the Russians have to fight their own ruling class, we have to find our ruling class, and so on, right? Because and then finds answers there, right? And I don't know, right? Like I'm aware of the potential of humans, right? We're not just good or bad. And that's what I reject this notion that just because you're white, you're fucking evil and you're automatically racist, the potential is there anywhere, right? Like you said, you have forks on the road. And those are things that we're going to have to find answers for in a collective way, right? And get through our differences. Because again, when we reject identity politics, it's not that we're saying there is no racism, there is no sexism. It's just that the conversation is had in under a certain framework, right? Just like what we call technology and science is under a framework of capitalism, and so we don't know what kind of technologies because in science we would produce, right, with a different set of priorities and constraints. But I do think we live in a world that, for better or for worse, we do have the capacity to sustain life. So this narrative of limited resources, that's bullshit. Like, this is it's not about the resources to sustain life, and the billions that we are. It's about the priorities that we have, right? And so I don't think we'll totally reject all the stuff that that has been marked by blood, right? We're gonna have to sort it through this stuff and accept that reality, right, of where it came from, as a warning for the future. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess that's what I would say about this stuff, because what we just discussed, right, is the warning of what's coming, right? Because the gears are moving in that direction in a similar manner. Of maybe they're not getting into a room in Berlin, the people right now, because I think they know that they're, again, going back, Africa is already been discovered. Every corner of this world has already been colonized in some form or another. And so the room to move is very tight, and some states are gonna have to push others out of the way. And so, yes, technology will be part of this, and everyone has a stake in it now.
Well, all I can say is, I think we're wrapping up. Is one, first off, I appreciate, there's been all this stuff, Kamala Harris and Trump and the elections. Kenny, I appreciate you really sticking to this stuff about Africa and saying, hey, we want to discuss this. So I feel like this conversation has been very grounding for me to have our next week conversation, but even just to talk about something that's just not theater. That stuff's important, but actually, to me right now, this is a lot more important. And Alex, I appreciate you just bringing such a sharp historical thing to this. It's really forcing me to step up my game in terms of my own research and looking into stuff. So it's just good to have you part of this. So this is very exciting. It's interesting to think I know about something, and then I look into it and I'm like, oh, I didn't know a lot of things. And some of these details, they're very important, I think. They're very important because they expose how deep the lie goes. So appreciate you both.
And it may seem that it was 150 years ago, right? Like the Berlin Conference happened, but it's like you, Alex, have given me two perspectives when you've focused on the First World War, and then it turns out that it's not just that period, it's the period right before, and it all connects right into where we are now. And we've mentioned here, right, the importance of knowing history, because it was real. It's not just letters in pictures on a textbook or a video on YouTube. This shit that was real, that affected real people, with hopes and dreams, just like us. And a big metal shoe fell on their fucking head, and we just happen to know that there is a fucking big metal shoe coming on our head.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you both. Eduardo, we hope to see you again next week. That does it for this week's episode. What's Left as a weekly political podcast channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and guests on the episode notes wherever you found this episode or on our blog, what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find past episodes of this podcast there and connect with us. I remind people, if you like anything you've heard, please subscribe, rate, review on your notifications, and try any of our, I think it's 7 platforms: Spotify, iTunes, Bitchute, Odysee, Rumble, YouTube, or Telegram. And if you'd like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, please contact us through our blog, and continue to give us comments in anything way you can. I think lots of people have been leaving some, particularly on YouTube, leaving some really good, interesting comments. So appreciate that from folks. So for myself, Andy, and Alex, and Kenny, that's it for this week, and hope to see you next week.